because it's the Yod side of Rochel Imenu, Yud Aleph Cheshvan is her things and so on. And I thought I'd speak about something about Rochel Imenu in her memory, in her schus, and so on. She's a very special person in Klal Yisrael. She died very young. She was, they say, either 36. I think the Vilna Gaon says she was 36, and someone said she was 45. So she was spectacularly young. I mean, the people who lived at that time lived for a long time. I mean, Avraham lived over, I think, 175, and so on. And Yaakov lived. They all lived very long. They didn't live as long as the people in the time of Noach. You know, these people lived hundreds of years. Noach lived, I think, 700 years. I don't know exactly the amount of time. Noach?
Yeah, Noach.
He lived 900.
Shame 600.
Wow. Wow, 900 years. You know, one wonders what to do for 900 years. People are exhausted from life. People are exhausted from life.
What's that? 969 years. Mr. Shalach, 569 years.
He was the most, the long-living of all human beings, Mr. Shalach, because Noach lived only, Adam Arichin, he lived only 930 years. Because he gave 70 years of his life to David HaMelech, because I once spoke about this, and he was the Mashiach ben David, actually, Adam Harishon, Kodim Achet, and because of the sin, then the Mashiach ben David had to die. In other words, he killed the Mashiach ben David because he was supposed to be the Mashiach ben David because he sinned, and he never became that. So therefore, he gave 70 years of his life to David HaMelech and so on. So David HaMelech didn't live very long either. But Rochel Imenu lived a paltry. I mean, she lived, I think, according to the Vilna Gaon, she died at 36, which is astonishing. And not only she died at 36, but she was buried like on the road to Beis Lechem, which is in the West Bank, which is not far, I think, from Hebron. But it was actually totally, she was buried on the way, which means she was buried nowhere. She never was buried in the Ma'oros HaMachpelah, and never got there. And Yaakov Avinu buried her on the way, on the road, actually, on the side of the road, in Nefaf and Beis Lechem. And, her grave is completely abnormal. Her grave is not even in a cemetery, which is shared by many people in a cemetery, which is a common place where they bury people, but she was buried all alone, in the middle of nowhere. So that really begs the question: why would Rochel Imenu, the matriarch Rochel, buried in the middle of nowhere? In fact, the real question is, what was the whole story of really Rochel Imenu? And what makes her story so spectacular, if I may say, was there's a medrash that says to some extent her story. And we really don't understand who she was and so on. But according to the medrash, when the Jewish people were attacked by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians were taking on themselves to destroy the Beis Hamikdash, and the Jewish people, after the destruction of the temple, I think the Jewish people were taken out of Israel and they were brought to Babylonia. But the road to Babylonia, which is in southern Iraq and so on, passed by that place where Rochel Imenu was buried. So the Medrash says a very amazing story, which a lot of people don't know what that story is, and I'm going to repeat it in her memory, in what exactly happened and what she did. Because in my opinion, the world has a certain impression of Rochel Imenu as having done something really incredible, but no one really knows what that is. That's right. First of all, I want to talk about that and tell you what the Medrash says about her. It says that when the Jewish people were being exiled, all the Avos and Moshe Rabbeinu and all the many of the great tzaddikim who died, who weren't dead yet. Actually, they were dead. They were dead, and they all turned to God to try and talk to God to have mercy on the Jews and on Klal Yisrael, to in some way bring them back, eventually back to Eretz Yisrael, and so on. So the others first went to God, Avram first, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, and Aaron. I mean, all the great personages in Klal Yisrael went to God to please beg him to restore the Jews from the exile. And the Rebbe did not answer anyone. The Rebbe fundamentally confronted each one, and he did not reply, and he said nothing. So therefore, it was seen that none of the tzaddikim who implored the Rebbe to bring them back and redeem them, and the Rebbe did not answer them. He didn't say anything. He was silent. So therefore, they failed in their prayers. So finally, Rochel Imenu comes to him, and she comes to God, and she says to please bring these people back from the exile. And suddenly God speaks and answers her. And why he answers her, we'll speak about it in a minute, but God says, Mini koili mi bechi. It's in Yirmiyah. The actual medrash comes from Yirmiyah, and Yirmiyah repeats the conversation that God had with Rochel, the wife of Yaakov Avinu. And he says to her, remove your tears, withhold your tears from Klal Yisrael, that I will redeem them. He makes a promise to Rochel Imenu, and only to Rochel Imenu, that he will redeem the children of Israel. He will redeem them. But he will not redeem them now at this point. This was the first real Golus outside of the land of Israel. Up to then, all the troubles that the Jews had were that they were inside the land of Israel. And this was not anything ever experienced before, where the Jews were suddenly captured and taken out of the land of Israel, and so on. But I think this was the Golus of Babylonia. I think this was the Golus of Assyria. But in any case, the Rebbe had never taken the Jews out of the land of Israel. And he says to Rochel that, okay, I will restore them back to the land of Israel. And I promise you this fact. Now the question, of course, was, why was Rochel Imenu the only one that he said this to? And why did he not answer any of the other tzaddikim, the Avos and Moshe Rabbeinu and so on and so forth, about this fact? Why did he not answer them? So what is said is that Rochel Imenu did something which was almost incomparable. It was so astounding that Rochel actually rose to the level, and this is what I say, it's very hard to understand, that all the patriarchs, all the Avos, were very great tzaddikim, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and so on. But Rochel Imenu, actually, who was the wife of Yaakov, actually in that, in a certain capacity, rose to the level of almost an Av. That's right. She's the only one of all the matriarchs, the wives of the Avos, Sarah, Rivka, Leah, and so on. But she's the only one of the Avos which rose to a level of, she was almost an Av. Now, what does that mean, almost an Av? That means she's considered actually one of the founders of Klal Yisrael. She was not simply the wife of one of the patriarchs, one of the Avos, who had Klal Yisrael, that generations from the Avos came from, but in a certain sense, she was almost a shirish. That means she was almost a root of Klal Yisrael, and she had almost the status of an Av. Not only that, she had a son, like her sons were supposed to be some of the Shvatim, but she had one son, Yosef Atzadik, who was so great that he's considered the greatest of all the tribes, Yosef. So that Yosef, there was actually supposed to be 12 tribes, according to one each month of the year. And she had Yosef, and from Yosef there came 2 tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh. And these were considered 2 separate tribes. The children of Yosef themselves were tribes, and this was unheard of from all the other 12 tribes. Each of the 12 Shvatim, the tribes from Israel, which came from Yaakov, was therefore considered one of the 12 tribes of Israel. But the tribe of Yosef was divided into 2, and it became 2 separate individual tribes. So because of that, Yosef himself took on the status of almost an Av as well. So not only did his mother have the status of almost being an Av, but her son, Yosef, had that also. So there was something outstanding about this woman which was not comparable to any of the other Himos. So, of course, the question is, what did she do that was so incredible? And the thing what she did is that she allowed, because of her schus, she allowed the midas harachamim, the attribute of mercy, to hold sway and dominance over the midas hadin. And by doing that, she actually saved Klal Yisrael. Now, that's a very difficult thing for an individual to do. To do that, really, you have to be an Av. The 3 of us actually did the same thing. Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, all of them were able to surround Klal Yisrael with the midas haracham, the attribute of mercy. So what is it that she did? That she did the same thing. She allowed God, she created such a schus that God was able to call forth the attribute of mercy, midas haracham, and suspend the midas hadin. So what it is said about her is what she did something extraordinary with her sister, Leah. Because the truth is that really from Rochel Imenu was supposed to come the 12 tribes. The whole destiny of the Jewish people and of Klal Yisrael in their assignment to save the world from ibud, from annihilation, according to the Mitzvah Din, that whole thing was supposed to happen to Rochel. She was supposed to be the only wife of Yaakov, and therefore she was supposed to support the whole efforts of Yaakov Avinu to bring Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael was supposed to come from Rochel alone, and therefore she would have been the main imah, the main mother, matriarch for Klal Yisrael. But what happened? Leah, her sister, who was actually older, much older than her, but she also died young. I think Leah died she died older, but in her 50s and 60s. I don't know, but Leah also died young, relatively. and her destiny was to the people, the Jewish people, for the remainder of history. But Leah was very disturbed when she found out that Rochel was going to become the mother of Klal Yisrael. But she was not disturbed because of that. She was disturbed because it seemed to be her destiny that she would have to marry Yaakov's brother, his older brother, not really his older, they were twins, Esav. In other words, Rochel was supposed to marry Yaakov, and Esav, the wife of Esav was supposed to be Leah. And Leah was very shamed. She did not know what would happen to her, and she was terribly shamed and terribly depressed. And Rochel saw this. And what Rochel did was suddenly she said, I cannot take on my destiny if it means that my sister will bear that level of shame. So therefore she said, I will give it up. I will give up my chelek and let Leah have that chelek, which is actually astounding. And what she did was she allowed Leah and she assisted Leah in marrying her, what should have been her husband, Yaakov, to Leah. That's right. Because they made a certain agreement, Yaakov and Rochel, that Yaakov, on the day of his wedding, would give Rochel a certain code so that he would be able, she would know that that he would know it would be Rochel, because they thought that Lavan, his future father-in-law, would in some way conspire to have Yaakov marry Leah in some way. So they created this kind of system. And what happened was Rochel actually gave that code to Leah so that Leah could marry Yaakov first and alone. In other words, she was willing to give up her complete destiny, which is the highest destiny in the world, because she would be the mother of Klal Yisrael, which was this astonishing chelek for Klal Yisrael in terms of human history. But she was willing to give that up because of the embarrassment of her sister. And this, when God saw this, such a sacrifice, I mean, it was one of the most incredible sacrifices, because it was not simply that Rochel was willing to give her husband Yaakov to another woman. That itself is quite remarkable, that she was willing to allow Leah to marry Yaakov and not marry him at all. That was also because Yaakov loved Rochel in a very special way, and Rochel loved Yaakov. They were really, I mean, one of the greatest couples that were ever created. Yet she could not take that destiny and then embarrass Leah and leave her in a totally depressed and inhumane condition. And she was willing not only to give up Yaakov Avinu, her husband, but she was willing to give up her destiny, one of the highest destinies ever given to a human being, because at the price that she was asked to do that, by allowing her sister to be totally submissive and totally depressed and broken, she could not take that role, and she was willing to give it up. Now, what was significant about that role? You see, the one thing about God, the thing which most impresses God is what? Is if you behave exactly like God. And in terms of an action, what is the greatest action which God always does? It's a singular category of actions that only God can do. And any human being that suddenly partakes of this action is said to be godly. Like it says, Mahu Rachum Afato Rachum. Chazal say that the more you imitate the actions of God, the more you identify with the divine essence, with the Shekhinah. And what is that action? It's very simple. That action is giving. In other words, when you give pure giving, not a concept of taking. God has nothing to do with taking. Taking has to do with a dependent person in some way because of a need or because of a want. And the greatest attribute of God is that God has no needs, number one, but more than that, God has no wants. So in a certain sense, God is completely removed from the action of giving. From the action of taking. God is completely removed from the action of taking. In a certain way, taking, the action of taking, is not part of God's vocabulary. So this action which Rochel was doing, was giving up her future husband, number one, and giving up the destiny of Klal Yisrael, number two, was a total act of giving. Because what it means is that Rochel would be for the rest of her life in a sad state. So therefore what? So therefore that condition which Leah was about to receive from Rochel, was, even though that would resurrect Leah from depression and being broken, but the same action that Rochel was about to do for her sister Leah would put her in a depression or some kind of state. But she was willing to take on this role, and so it was a role of suffering. It was a tremendous role of Sovle Chaloim, because this was not simply Rochel giving up a love. This was Rochel giving up her zivug. Yaakov Avinu was the emissary zivug from Rochel Imenu, and she was willing to give up her zivug, the soul that should become attached to her in certain ways. Why? So that her sister would not bear the kind of suffering that seemed to be destined for her. So God saw this as a profound giving. It was so profound, it was something that it was worthy to put the Rochel on the pedestal of almost being an Of. So God said, well, by doing this, you have become a representative of the agent of the Midah of Rachamim. And therefore, you are the only one that I can answer. Because, to save Klal Yisrael from a doom, from exile, a person has to have the schus to that level of rachamim. And what you have done basically qualifies you for this. So that's why God said to her, for you I promise. To no one else did God ever give this promise. And he said, because of your act of giving, because actually you replicated my act of giving. And therefore I am able to promise you that in your schus, I will redeem Klal Yisrael. And so on, and they will be saved. So Rochel therefore takes up the title, the aim, the mother of Klal Yisrael, and the mother of the Geula itself. Whenever people think of Rochel, they think of a person who represents the schus of the Geula, of the redemption of mankind, the redemption of the universe, the redemption of all existence, because of the mazel, because of the tachlis, the purpose of Klal Yisrael. And God was saying to her, I promise you that I will do this. So this was an extraordinary thing. And that's why the schus of Rochel Imenu is so great that I say hundreds of thousands of Jews come to daven by her grave in order to promote that possibility. And this is really astounding, and so on. So even though Rochel Imenu is not buried in a cemetery, you will not find the grave of Rochel Imenu in a cemetery. You will not find her grave by the Ma'as Machpelah, not at all. Where will you find her? You will find her alone between Beis Lechem and so on. You will find her over there on the side of the road. And that's where she's been since she died a long time ago. And this, when she died, the tribes, the sons of Yaakov, asked them, why are you burying our mother on the side of the road? Isn't she supposed to be buried with you in the Mars of Machpelah, the cave of Machpelah, which, by the way, the Medrash says is the entrance to Gan Eden. It's a vortex. It's a wormhole between the world of Ruchnius and the world of Gashmius. That's according to what Chazal say. That's the power of the Mars Machpelah. It's not an ordinary grave, It represents a kind of connection, a union between Ruchnius and Gashmius, in a certain sense. And Yaakov Avinu said to his sons, the reason why I'm burying her, because of what she did, she has earned the ability to derive a promise from God that if the Jews are not zocher to the Geula, if the Jews, I should say, if the Jews are somehow have the fault and suddenly they are to be exiled from the land of Israel, in Hoschus, God will turn it around and one day redeem the Jews for the Geula. And therefore I am burying on this spot. Why? Because it's on this spot that the Jews will pass as they go into exile. In the future, when the Jews again will sin and go into exile, they will pass on this road, and so on. Hundreds of thousands will pass on this road. And on this road, she will be here. And why over here? Because most people, I don't know if they realize that. What Yaakov did, he buried Rochel in exile too. That's exactly her position where she is buried now, in the middle of nowhere, not in a cemetery. But he buried her in a road which the Jews would eventually take one day when they will go into exile. So that means that Rochel herself was in exile. In other words, she doesn't rest. Her body does not rest. It is in exile. That's where she was buried. So just like the Jews are going to go into exile, she is in exile, and she is able to say with them, look, I share with you the exile. Because just as you are going out of Israel to some foreign country, I am also in a state of exile. Because I am not where I'm supposed to be. And where is that? I'm supposed to be in the Mars Machpelah. Right? It is I who should be there, not Leah. But I give Leah that spot so that I protect her from such pain. So therefore, I am willing, on my own, I'm willing to go into exile so that my body will lie in exile, in Golus. So that in some way, this Soivlich Haloim, this pain that I am suffering, and so on, that you also will someday be able to come back, just like I will come back one day at the end of time, whenever there's a Geula, and I will come back, my position will be changed. When the Geula happens, I will come back to Eretz Yisrael, to the Mars Machpelah. And that will happen just like you will one day come back to Eretz Yisrael after a long Golus for you. So the condition of Rochel, and most people, I don't know if they realize this, Rochel herself went into Golus. She was buried in Golus. She was buried nowhere outside of a cemetery on the side of a road. She took on the same status as the Jewish people. And by taking on the same status, she replicated the Jewish people when they were in Golus. So Rochel says to them, I will also be in Golus. My burial place will be in Golus. And this is the meaning that Rochel is buried on the side of the road on the way to Lechem. And this is what Yaakov Avinu said. Why? Because in a certain way, Rochel took on the role of what? Of a Soivlich Haloim, the role of a Mashiach himself. In other words, in a certain way, she prefaced her role of Yosef. Yosef would become, her son, would become the founder of the generation of Mashiach ben Yosef, which represents tremendous rachamim for Klal Yisrael, because the Mashiach ben Yosef is a Soivlich Haloim. He suffers so that Klal Yisrael does not suffer. He replicates the condition of Klal Yisrael who sins. But rather than have Klal Yisrael take on the burden of that sin, so that sin can appear in them as an neshama, it does not. That the external aspect of Klal Yisrael doesn't record really the sins that they do. So just like the Mashiach ben Yosef is the greatest Sover L'Chaloim for Klal Yisrael, and he saves Klal Yisrael from the appearance of a sin that they should possess, but instead he possesses. And whether you realize it or not, what most people, I don't know, realize it in Klal Yisrael, what is the tachlis of the Mashiach ben Yosef? The tachlis of the Mashiach ben Yosef is to represent Klal Yisrael. How? By being Klal Yisrael. In other words, he takes on the burden of these sins. He takes on the burden of all the things, and that's symbolized by the boar of Yosef, that the grave, when these brothers sold Yosef, they put him into a pit. And in that pit was nechoshim, snakes, and akravim, scorpions. They threw him in that pit, hoping that he would die in the pit. And that boar, which Yosef was, represents the tachlis of Mashiach ben Yosef, that he is always near death. There's always the possibility of him dying from the choshim and akravim, and so on. And why nechoshim and akravim? Why? Because a nachash is a serpent. It represents a serpent. And why were there serpents in that boar, in that pit? For Yosef. And these were poisonous snakes. Why? Because he has to suffer that which Klal Yisrael should have suffered, but doesn't. He takes on their suffering of the what? Of the nachash. And the nachash is the symbol of the Yetzer Hara. The nachash, as a poisonous snake, is the symbol of Zohamah. And Zohamah, which is the Malach HaMavis, Zohamah, which is represented by the Malach HaMavis, takes his domination because of the sin of the first snake, what's called the Nachash HaKadmoni. So the reason why that pit takes on poisonous snake, because the whole reason why Mashiach ben Yosef suffers instead of Klal Yisrael is because that sin because that sin comes from the Nachash HaKadmoni, the first serpent who represented the Chet of Chava and Adam Arishim. And that Chet is represented by the snake. So that's why the snake threatened Yosef while he was in the pit. But not only that, what else was in the pit? The akrav. An akrav is a scorpion. Why were there scorpions in that pit that threatened the life of Yosef? What does that mean? Because when did Rochel die? Rochel died way before her time. Rochel should have lived much longer. But Rochel died in advance, in a very short time. Why? She died on the road, in exile, and so on. But when did she die? She died in the zodiac month of Akrav, Scorpio. She died in the month of Scorpio, which represents the scorpion. The time that she died was in what? She died in Cheshvan, Mar Cheshvan, which has no yontif in it at all. And it's the only month of the year that has no day of Kedusha. That's right. They say that the only day of Kedusha that Scorpio, to be born in Scorpion, will be after the Geula. When the Geula comes to Klal Yisrael in the future time, that Geula will be represented by a yontif that will be created by the Geula itself. Every month of the year has some kind of yontif in it, except Mar Cheshvan. And that month is November. It's the month of Cheshvan in November, approximately the end of October, and in November itself. That is the month which is represented by the zodiac sign of Scorpio, of the scorpion. And what happened in Cheshvan? Well, that's when Rochel Imenu died. She died in the month of Cheshvan, the month which has no yontif at all. Why? Because that yontif, which will appear in the month of Cheshvan, which corresponds to approximately November, will finally only appear at the end of time when the Geula comes, because Rochel Imenu, that's when she died. And when the Geula happens, there will be a Yontif, I think, a Yontif on that day, and Yud Aleph Cheshvan will become a Yontif, because that will represent the Geula. That's the day that Rochel died, and so on. So therefore we see that the day of her death was actually the promise of the Rabbanu Shalom that he will bring her Geula. He will bring her prayers, and he will say, it is due to your prayers and the success of your prayers that I will redeem Klal Yisrael. And on the day you die, that will become maybe perhaps in that month, Cheshvan will suddenly have, on the day that you died, the goal itself. So because of the fact that Rochel died because of the sin, because in certain ways because of the sin of all the sins of Klal Yisrael, and because Rochel died and so on and so forth, because she would be the mother of the redemption, she died in Cheshvan, which will someday have a Yontif, well, maybe will become greater than all the Yom Tovim. So there was Noshin, Nechoshim, snakes and scorpions in that pit that threatened Yosef HaTzadik. And he could have died from any one of them, any a scorpion or from a snake. So now we understand two things, right? We understand why Rochel was buried outside of the Morzan Kpela and in the middle of nowhere. It was her exile that would replace, would simultaneously be the exile of Klal Yisrael, number one. And she died in the month of Cheshvan, because in Cheshvan also would be what? Would be the scorpion, which would be the mazel. Scorpio is supposed to be the most spiritual of all the zodiac. Even though the zodiac has many spiritual months, the greatest month, people who are born in Scorpio generally have the highest level of spirituality in a certain sense. Another month which is similar to that is Pisces. And Moshe Rabbeinu was born in Pisces, which corresponds to after Aries, which corresponds to the month of Purim. So the zodiac sign of Pisces, the fish, which is the month of Purim, and Scorpio, which is the month of Mar Cheshvan, and so on, the month of the Scorpion, are the two most powerful signs of spirit, of Ruchnius. So that's why she died in the month of Scorpion, Mar Cheshvan. So we see that this is not random at all. That every fact of her death and every fact of her life was also, she became a Mashiach ben Yosef. That's right. Probably the only woman in history that took on the role of Mashiach ben Yosef. That she died in exile, and her schus is from exile, because she replicated the punishment of Klal Yisrael similar to her son, Yosef HaTzadik. But the real question that we have to ask is, what did Rochel do? Was that the reason why God answered her? Was she zocher to be a quasi-Mashiach ben Yosef? And that's what she became. If you want to know what the schus of Rochel Imenu was, she was a quasi, an actual partial Mashiach ben Yosef itself, even though she was a woman. And as the Mashiach ben Yosef, as a quasi Mashiach ben Yosef, as a partial, actual Mashiach, as a Messiah, she was almost equivalent to an Av. So she was very similar to her son, Yosef HaTzadik himself. And the two had similar mazolos. But the question was, we have to really understand is, what was her real schus? Was this her schus that she replicated with Klal Yisrael? And what I'm going to say, this was not her real schus. She was not really representing Klal Yisrael and thereby saving them from the exile, and therefore having them given a redemption. Her real schus was not that she brought the Geula to Klal Yisrael, although that's what everyone says. She's the aim of the Geula. So what really was it? So I would like to prefer another theory of what the real source of Klal Yisrael really was, how she saved Klal Yisrael. We all know that Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, have Taryag Mitzvahs, 630 commandments. That was the Torah that was given to them and so on. And from the 630 commandments, the ability to operate and to function in 630 commandments required 3 components that came together as an organism. And what are these 3 components? The first component was the Jewish people themselves. They were the ones who actually did the mitzvahs. So therefore, they are a major component for the Taryag mitzvahs, because it was the Taryag mitzvahs that guaranteed the ability of Klal Yisrael to survive. And that gave them the free will to do it. Because the Taryag mitzvahs created the possibility of rehabilitation. Because originally the 7 mitzvahs from Noah were all performance mitzvahs. But the 630 mitzvahs of the Torah are not only performance mitzvahs, they are rehabilitation mitzvahs. Because many of them have to do to Klal Yisrael if Klal Yisrael sins. If a person, for example, does a certain sin, which really the punishment of that sin is chorus, an early death, and so on. So what happens? So the Torah says you have to bring a korban, a chayav ekrisis, that you have to bring instead because you did a sin which obligates the death penalty of chorus. And if you bring that korban, you will be totally forgiven, guaranteed forgiven. So therefore, we see something very astounding, which happened this week. When God said to Avram Avinu, I'm going to give you the Torah, which has 630 mitzvahs, and this will create a status of Klal Yisrael that will be different than the status of the 7 mitzvahs of Bnei Noach or the 1 mitzvah of Adam Rishon. And what is that status? That status will be that not only will they have mitzvahs for performance that they have to do, like stealing and loving your neighbor and so on, but they would have mitzvahs that will rehabilitate them if they sin. And this will guarantee their appearance in Olam Haba. The reason why God said to Avram that every Jew has a chelik in Olam Haba. Why? Because that chelik is almost guaranteed to him from the Taryag mitzvahs, the performance mitzvahs, and the rehabilitation. If he does this act of rehabilitation and so on, and cure, then I will forgive him for that sin, and therefore he is almost guaranteed that he will go to Olam Haba. And that's the power of the 630 mitzvahs. So the second component of a Jew is, number one, he has the Kedusha in him, that he's able to perform the 630 mitzvahs with free will. The free will of the Jewish people is not like the free will of all the other nations of the world. The free will of the Jewish people is in 613 actions, corresponding to the actions of the 630 mitzvahs. In any other action that a Jew does, which does not relate to the 630 mitzvahs, it only appears to him like he's doing what he wants to do, that he has free will. He does not have free will. In other words, all the actions of a person are divided into 2 categories. There are actions which they can do, which has free will. God does not determine what that action will include. That's totally up to their free will. And then there's certain actions that everyone does, which has no free will. It feels like it has free will, and a person cannot really see whether he's free will in action because they all feel the same. But most of the actions that a Jew does that's not related to the 630 commandments do not have free will. He's doing those actions because that's the will of God. So that's called hashpah, the actions which he does, which are many actions. This is called hashpah, an influence, milamala lamata, that comes from above, down here, which means that the origin of the action or the possibility of action does not come from his free will. It comes from above. It comes from the world of Ruchnius, down to the world of Gashmius. And it doesn't involve free will. But all the actions that have to do with the mitzvahs, the 630 categories of mitzvahs, relate to actions which all have a basis in free will. And that's called the hashpor milamata, from below, the milamala, to above. So therefore, the actions of a person, of a Jew, has two directions. Those actions which are precipitated by the energy from above to below, which has no free will, and the actions that are precipitated by a person himself with free will. And these relate to the 600 commandments. And there are no exceptions to this rule. Even though a person thinks that he has free will and he can do whatever he wants, that's not true. That only applies to the actions of free will, which is the greatest actions of all. And that permits a Jew to go to Olam Haba, the free will of 613 circumstances which allow him to acquire the future world and the future life, which is beyond time, beyond space, and beyond the actions. So that's the second component. Therefore, a Jew earns Olam Haba, the future world, because he has the Kedusha to perform that. In other words, if a goy does the 630 commandments, he does not have the ability to create Olam Haba. The goy does not have the ability to create Olam Haba. He does have the ability to reside in Olam Haba if he does the 7 mitzvahs. The goy has retained the mitzvahs which Noah had, and through those mitzvahs, he earns Olam Haba. But he has no ability to qualify for Olam Haba on the basis of 613. If he does those 613 actions alone, he does not qualify for Olam Haba. It has no effect on him. Because in order to qualify Olam Haba, you have to have a soul which has the ability to respond to the stimulus of 630 mitzvahs. And that is a Jewish soul. From the Ranchi, Nefesh Ruach Chaya, Nefesh Ruach Neshama Chaya Yechida. The only neshama that can actually get, the only person who can actually get a soul, which is equivalent to the Yechida, which is a soul in Olam Haba, is a Jew. A guy cannot attain that. He can attain a possibility to reside in Olam Haba, but he cannot attain the ability to create Olam Haba. Only the Jew can do this, because he has 2 mitzvahs, performance and rehabilitation. A goy only has performance mitzvahs. He does not have rehabilitation. He can somewhat rehabilitate himself through the action of tshuva, the action of repentance, but he cannot rehabilitate himself to the extent where he can cancel all his sins. They have a much greater power to annihilate him than the Taryag mitzvahs has to annihilate the Jews. And this is the critical difference between a Jew and a goy. So therefore, the Kedusha of a Jew, the Kedusha's Klal Yisrael, is one critical component of a future resident of Olam Haba. The other resident, the other future power, is the 630 mitzvahs. By doing those mitzvahs, you can acquire Olam Haba. But there's a third component, that's right, which most people don't realize. And that third component is Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. If you ask most people, why is it that the Jews are assigned the land of Israel? What is so special about the land of Israel that this is the ultimate destiny of the Jewish people in Olam Hazeh? That by the Geula, by the redemption, the Jews will be returned to the land of Israel. The land of Israel seems to be a geographical location. What makes that land so special? What makes those lands so special is because God says that if the Jews are in the land of Israel and they worship idols, they do avodah zarah, the land will throw them out. It will vomit them out. It uses the verb lahoki, to vomit. Now, it's a question, how can a land vomit? Vomiting is a biological process in which the body You see, it reverses the direction of its esophagus, so all the food does not go down to the stomach from the mouth. It rather goes from the stomach back up to the mouth, and it expels the food which is toxic. Vomiting is only be done by a living thing. So by God saying that the land can vomit you out if you worship idols, God is saying that this land is not like every other geographical area on earth. This land is a living. This land is alive. It's like a biological entity. And not only that, you know it's alive because this land takes place in the performance of mitzvahs. There are many mitzvahs which cannot be done outside of the land of Israel. You have to be in the kedusha and the holiness of the land of Israel so that you can You can perform these mitzvahs. Like, for example, Trumas and Maasros, the matnas kahuna, which you give to the Kohen, which is called Truma, you do not give Truma outside of the land of Israel. And not only that, prophecy, for example, only resides in the land of Israel. True prophecy cannot be given outside of the land of Israel. So once the Jews went into the land of Israel in the time of Yehoshua ben Nun, not when they were in the desert, because they never became fully Jews. When the Jews, when they listened to the spies and they suddenly rebelled against Moshe Rabbeinu and against God, and they said, we will never go in there, and therefore they were mourning, God said to them, so in that case, the punishment for the sin of the spies was that the Jews never became completed. It wasn't that they died in the land, in the Midbar, in the desert. Many people think that the Jewish punishment was that they died in the desert. They died in the desert of Sinai, and they never reached the land of Israel. So all the Jews who were in that generation, in that time, by the spies, the sin of the spies, died in the desert of Sinai. But that wasn't their real punishment. Their real punishment wasn't that they had to die in the desert. Their real punishment is that they would never go into the land of Israel. They would die before they reached that land. And what does this mean? This means that the Jews would never complete this organism called Klal Yisrael. Why? Because it's true they would have Taryag mitzvahs, yes. It's true they would have the Kedusha of giving of the Torah, but they would never get the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. And that Kedusha is also necessary to perform many of those mitzvahs. So therefore the Jews never became a complete, a full, and a perfected organism that's capable of taking Olam Hazeh, this world and time, and creating Olam Haba. The Jews who died in the desert because of the sin of the spies were never able to create Olam Haba. They were never able to create the future world because they died in the desert, and they were never able to do that class of mitzvahs which were rehabilitative, or which in some way had to do with the freedom that entitles the Jew to get Olam Haba. So therefore, the true punishment of the Jews who sinned with the spies was that they never became fully Jews, because they never were qualified to take the Taryag mitzvahs. No Jew who died in the desert, the Midbar Sinai, ever became a full Jew. And this was only finally done with Yehoshua ben Nun, when he brought the Jews, who's left of the Jews, well, there were only two Jews, Yehoshua ben Nun and Kalev ben Yefuna. Those are the only two that really survived, because they didn't sin with the spies. So everyone else died fundamentally.
Those two were Mashiach ben Yosef and David. Yeshua was from Yosef.
Okay.
And Kalev was from Yehuda.
Yes, but they never participated in the sin of the spies. But everyone else fundamentally didn't. And therefore, they never became an organism which has the power to change a universe which is dominated by time, space, and action, into a universe that's dominated by awareness, where they suddenly achieved the highest level, where there was no time, There was no space and there was no ability to do an action. They became eternal. And they were only able to do that as a triplicate organism of being a Jew, of having the Taryag mitzvahs, of being a Jew, of having the Taryag mitzvahs, and being in the land of Israel. Because it was those three components that gave you the power to create Olam Haba. And that's what the Jews lost in the desert. That's what the Dor HaMidbar, the generation of the desert, lost. They never became real Jews. And that's why the Sefer Yeshua, which is part of Tanakh, which is part of Nach, the Nevi'im Kesuvim, that's why the Sefer Yeshua is really part of the Torah itself. It has a similar sanctity to what? It has a similar sanctity to the 5 books of Moses, to the Torah Moshe, which is the only book that's in the Nevi'im prophets, and that's the book of Yeshua. That's why that book is similarly considered part of the original Torah itself. Because that's when they finally went into Israel. So the fact that they went into Israel completes all of them as Jews, as an organism, as an entity which has the ability to what? Don't forget, the Jew has the greatest power that has ever been seen. What is it the Jew can do that no other Jew can do? He becomes the gatekeeper to Olam Haba. He can take an existential plane, which is governed by time, past, present, future, space, distance from one place to another, an action, and the ability to do a Maisa. And that guarantees, through free will, the Taryag mitzvahs, the ability to transform Olam Hazeh, this world, in time, space, and action, into eternity, where there is no time, no space, and no action. You have any idea what the power to transform is? To take a universe from one level and restore it to a universe on another level. That is an act of creation, an act of yesh me'ayin in a certain sense, that comes from the free will of Jews. The Jew has the power of creation itself, formation itself. He forms the future world. The world which is eternal, never ends. It has no end because it has no time. No one can do that but the Jew. He is the gatekeeper. That's why all the anti-Semites, they are in for a terrible din. Because every anti-Semite will be annihilated. Why? Because they attempt to kill the gatekeeper for eternity, the only one who can create eternity, and they have no concept of that. They do not know that when they perform anti-Semitic acts and so on, they don't know that they are actually interfering with the most powerful man on earth. And therefore, they will experience annihilation themselves, having completely rejected the power to create Olam Haba. Since they interfered with the power to create Olam Haba, they will have nothing to do with Olam Haba. They cannot create it because they're not Jewish, and they cannot even experience it. They will not even be able to reside in it. Many Goyim will be able to reside in that, because Olam Haba is also given on a certain level for residents living there to even Goyim. That's why a Goy does not have to become Jewish, because he can earn Olam Haba on his own, even when he's a Goy, by observing the 7 commandments of Noah, not the 630 commandments. But an anti-Semite, he will be annihilated, because he's interfering with the very process of creating Olam Haba itself. So therefore, what do we see? What is a Jew? A Jew is a part, a component of an organism composed of 3 things that must be unified to give him the power to create Olam Haba. And what is that? That is what? That is, first of all, to be Jewish, to be born of a Jewish mother, number one. Number two, to have 630 commandments, the Taryag mitzvahs. And number three, to live in the land of Israel so that he can do the rest of the Taryag mitzvahs. And it's all three of these components that merge together to fundamentally qualify a person to be an instrument of transformation from a universe of time to a universe of no time at all. One is called a universe of time, which is called Zamanis, from the word Zaman, which means time. And the other world is called what? It's called a world of awareness, a world of eternity, Nitzchias. And Nitzchias means eternity, which means not endless time, but no time. And the only one who has this power is the Jew. And he has to have all three components. Wait a minute. So now we understand something from this which is shocking. That means that a Jew who goes into Eretz Yisrael and acquires the three components of the power, if he is exiled from the land of Israel and he has to go out of the land of Israel, what happens to him? One of these components, which is the land of Israel itself, suddenly becomes absent. That's right. So in that period, he loses that complete power because he's not a complete organism. So therefore, putting a Jew into exile, taking the Jewish people and putting them outside of the land of Israel, jeopardizes their ability to perform their function. It jeopardizes their ability to even exist. So fundamentally, the Midas Hadin, the attribute of justice, can annihilate them because they are no longer that kind of organism. So we see that at that time of Rochel Imenu, and at that time when the Jews go into exile, that they cannot exist as Jews anymore because 1/3 of their organs are ripped out. It's like a person without a heart, or a person without a kidney, or a person without a lung, or a person without a brain. A person cannot survive if one of these organs is gone. And they become an organism missing a life-given organ. And that's the land of Israel. So therefore, exile is not simply a punishment for the Jews. Exile is their destruction, is their termination. And most people don't even realize this. So when God wanted to exile the Jews, he fundamentally wanted to terminate them because of the sins that they did. So therefore, that's what Rochel Imenu did. Now we have a total understanding of who Rochel Imenu was. She is not simply a person who saved the Jews, who got God to promise her that he would return them. She didn't earn the Geula. It's not the Geula that she earned. It's not because of her schus that God promised her the redemption. She did not accomplish the redemption. That's not what she did. She is not the mother of redemption. She is the mother of exile. She, by praying to God, said, please God, even though the Jews are an organism and are required to be of three components, and even though now you plan to put them in Golus, and therefore you are ripping away one of the components of that organism that can transform the world into Olam Haba, I beg of you not to do this, to allow them to survive as an organism who does not have a heart, who does not have a lung, does not have a kidney or a brain. That's right. Normally that would be impossible. But when God said to her, your truth in the fact that you were totally giving, not taking, and you gave the greatest gift that I can give to a person, which is the destiny to mold the Jewish people to be the instrument of what? Not of the redemption, to be the instrument of eternity. The Jews are not the instrument of redemption. That's not what we're waiting for to be redeemed. We are waiting for eternity, Olam Haba. That's what we're waiting for. The only reason why we're waiting for redemption is why? Because we were put into Golus. You see, Golus is an artificial mechanism that was given us as a punishment, which we should not have survived. because it suddenly absents us from being a complete organism of eternity. The Jew is the organism that grants eternity. He is the organism of eternity. He is not the organism that's looking forward to the redemption. So Rochel Imenu, because of her schusim, allowed the Jews to survive even though they were not a full organism of eternity. That was what she did. And God said, because of what you did, that you did totally giving, you became my representative. You became, as a woman, mamish, a representative of Mashiach ben Yosef. So what I will do is I will bury you in exile. Yaakov, you will die young at 36, which is very young for a person at that age. And you will die young, and you will die, and you will be buried not in a cemetery, not in a cemetery with Jews. Rochel is not buried in a cemetery of Jews. She's not buried in the Beis HaKvorim. She has nothing to do with where Jews are buried. She is buried outside in exile, alone and on her own. And God said, just as I give you this exile, and you survive, because eventually, one day, you will return to the Ma'oretz HaMachpelah. That's where you will go. You will become the woman who is the foundation, the shirish, the root of Mashiach ben Yosef, the one who will save the world from Zoyama. Your son will be Yosef HaTzadik, and his sons will be two sons, Ephraim and Menashe. He will be like an Ov, like Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And you will be like a Mashiach, the Mashiach ben Yosef itself. So therefore, Rochel Imenu was not like one of the Amos. She's very different. She has the status of a Mashiach ben Yosef in a way, because she saved the Jews from annihilation. She saved the Jews from disappearing, from termination, because she allows them to exist, even though they are missing one of the life-giving organs that a person requires. So therefore, her true title is not the mother of the Gula. Her true title is the mother of the Gullus, because she allowed the possibility to sustain Gullus. She becomes the mother of the Gula. Why could God promise her that the Jews will be redeemed? Only because first, he can promise her that the Jews will survive in exile. Because if you cannot survive in exile, you cannot be redeemed. That's it. You're finished. So that because she enabled the possibility of surviving in an exile, she now retains the promise of redemption. And this is the action, really, this is the single action of a Mashiach ben Yosef. In that sense, she went to the level, the dynamic level of Mashiach ben Yosef, which she allowed the Zoyama to survive and continue to exist until the Geula. So therefore, she is a partner to her son. Her son is the Mashiach ben Yosef, the one who redeems Kal Yisrael from the war, from the famine that should have annihilated the Middle East. And her son redeems the Jewish people and the world from the Zoyama of the Nachash, so that the Malach HaMavos does not become the Malach HaIbud. Right? The Jews survived that Zoyama. So therefore, his mother, Yosef's mother, becomes the Mashiach ben Yosef that allows them to survive the exile. She allows the redemption to occur. So you see this clearly by where she's buried in exile and the month that she dies, which is the month of Cheshvan, which has no Yontif. Why? Because if you really think about it, every month of the year has a Yontif. It does. Except Cheshvan. That's why it's called Mar Cheshvan. Mar means bitterness. Bitterness. Why is the month of Cheshvan bitter? Because it has no Yontif. It has no Kedusha to it. That's why. So what does that mean? What it means is the following. Cheshvan, the month of Cheshvan, is also in Golus. You have to understand, everything about the Mashiach ben Yosef is a Golus. Rochel Imenu is in Golus. She is buried in Golus. Rochel Imenu died in Golus, in the month of Scorpio, which has no Kedusha. It's outside of any Yontif which has Kedusha. And she died in that month. She died in the month which is dominated by Nechoshim, snakes, Ve'akrovim, and what? And scorpions. That's the month that dominates. You know, there's a certain thing, it says it's a joke, and so on, that what happened was that there was a person, this is a fable in a certain sense, but it indicates what a scorpion is. That a certain person was by a river and so on, and then suddenly there's a scorpion that appears next to him, and the scorpion says, would you do me a favor? Could you carry me to the other side of the river? I can't swim. So the man said, of course, I'll do you the favor. So he puts the scorpion on his back, and he begins to cross the river. And right in the middle of the river, suddenly the scorpion stings him. It stings him with this poisonous, the needle on the back of it. So the man suddenly falls, and he begins to drown, and he says to him, how could you do this to me? I'm doing you a favor by carrying you across the river. And how could you sting me like this? And the scorpion says, because that's what I do. That's my essence. I have an organ in the back of me. It's an organ that can puncture someone and put in and enter poison, because that's what I am. That's my essence. So that's a joke, of course, but that's what they say about scorpions. You know, it's designed to kill, just like poisonous snakes are designed to kill. Both of them have venom. And where is that venom? In them. That venom is not outside of. That venom is part of their organism. And that venom is equivalent to zoama. Zoama is like venom. Where is that venom? Is it outside of the person? No, it's inside the person. When Chazal say that zoama is a venom of the Malach HaMavis, Hitlbo zoama, that when Chava sinned, she caused Adam to sin, and she sinned by eating from the Eitz HaDaas Tovira. She caused a venom to enter into her organism in the inside. And that venom will kill anything on the outside. And it will eventually could kill her. And it's what kills her. The curse of death created the Zohar of the Malach HaMavis. The curse of Zohar created the Malach HaMavis. And that's why people die. Because they have an internal venom that not only can kill other people, but it kills the person who possesses it. So scorpions and Nechoshim is what? So therefore, that's why it has nothing to do with Kedusha. It's a month which exists in exile. It's in Golus. Among all the other 11 months, it exists in exile. So therefore, everything about Rochel Imenu is about exile. She's buried in exile. She dies in the month of exile, and so on. And she finally, why? Because she exiled herself. She determined her own destiny. She ripped up her destiny from Klal Yisrael to be the mother of Klal Yisrael, the nation which has the Kedusha to create, to transform the world of eternity. And she permitted to go in exile. She went into exile intentionally to save her sister. And that was such an incredible action that God said to her, by doing this, you have giving. You have participated in the total process of giving. And I have never seen anything like this. So therefore, you are elevated to a new status. You are elevated to the status of becoming a Mashiach ben Yosef, the one who saves the world from Zoyama, because that's the power of Mashiach ben Yosef, to save the world from death, to save the world from Tumah, to save the world from the Zoyama of the Nachash. And you have risen to that status. So therefore, you have allowed the process of exile to the Jews without them being hurt permanently. It will not destroy them, although it should destroy them, because they are now no longer a complete organism of Kedusha. So therefore, when we think about the thing of Rochel Imenu transformed Klal Yisrael so that he could survive in Golus. Because why? Because Rochel Imenu transformed herself. She put herself in Golus. She absented herself. She removed herself from the tachlis of Klal Yisrael by giving the whole tachlis over to her sister. And for what reason? Because she could not stand. She said, I will not take this destiny if it means that my sister will be destroyed, that my sister, another person, will be terminated. And therefore I will go into Golus, even if it means my early death, even if it means I'm finished. Why? Because of my concern for my sister. And this was one of the greatest instances of self-sacrifice. So therefore, Rochel Imenu was not tied to the Geula, to the redemption. She is not. She is tied to the exile. She is in exile. She died in exile, in the month of the exile. And she allowed the exile to exist with Klal Yisrael. She is the mother of Golus. She's the Aim HaGolus. Oh, now we understand how she became the mother of redemption. Why? Because redemption is not the future destiny of Klal Yisrael. It's not. The future destiny of Klal Yisrael is eternity. Existence without time, space, or action. Eternity, not redemption. The only reason why we have to be redeemed is because we were foolish enough to do sins that put us in exile. And Rochel Imenu is the mother of the exile. And the exile can take place because she put herself in exile. And that you have to understand it. It was not simply that she saved her sister and allowed her sister to marry Yaakov Avinu. It was not simply that. Because she entertained the exile. She took on the cloak of exile in terms of what she did, in terms of what she gave to Leah. She said to Leah, you will go for me and I will go into exile. So God said to her, you have now dominated the characteristic, the function of exile. And therefore you allow me to put the Jews in exile so that it will rehabilitate them and eventually they will come back. You have hope because of what you did, that you gave and you willingly took on exile yourself. That exile now will be permitted to the Jews, and it will not annihilate them as the organism of Olam Haba. This is the source of Rochel Imenu. And this is what she is. It's very different than most people think. Most people think that the source of Rochel Imenu was simply what she did for Leah. It was much deeper than what she did for Leah. She did what? She put herself in exile, permanent exile, because she didn't know that Yaakov Avinu, she didn't know that God, he said to her, now that you have put yourself in exile, you have been elevated to the status of Mashiach ben Yosef, and therefore Yosef will come from you, not from Leah. The one who will remove the Zoyama of Klal Yisrael will come from you and not from Leah. You see it. And Yosef will have two sons, and therefore he will become a quatzai of. He will not be like the other Shvatim. Just like you are not from the other Imahos, you are not like what? Sarah, Rivka, and Leah. You are not like the other mothers, or Bilhah and Zilpah. You are not like the Imahos of Klal Yisrael. You have the status of a Mashiach, and you therefore have the status of an Ov. And you are special. And this is my gift to you. Because in doing what you did, you have did the one thing that I would do. My essence is giving, not taking. And by giving up the destiny of Klal Yisrael, by giving up all of that, you have imitated me. Because you have done the action of almost absolute giving. And for that, you are the other Mashiach. You're the silent Mashiach. So you will be in their golus of Klal Yisrael. But eventually, not only will the Jews be redeemed from that golus, but you will be redeemed. How? That's right. Nobody realizes the other point. You will be redeemed. Because one day you will go back and then you will be buried in the Ma'as HaMachpelah. You will be with your husband Yaakov. And then from that part, you will have Tchias HaMesim. You will be resurrected as a thing, as a Mashiach in a certain sense. So that's why Rochel is said to sing, I miss my son Yosef. I miss him. Because he is what evolved from my deeds. He came from my sacrifice. He came from my willingness to go into exile to save the Jewish people. So when God says there is hope for you, hope in what way? There is hope for you that the Jews will be able to live in exile and still be the organism that transforms Olam Hazeh to Olam Haba. This is Rochel Imenu. This is who she is. And that's why hundreds of thousands of people go to daven for her. Whenever a person requires an extra measure of Rahmanas from God, he doesn't go where? He doesn't go necessarily to even the Temple Mount, right? Because the temple is also in Golus. But where does he go? To the one person who supersedes the concept of annihilation, who creates the concept and permits the concept mitzad ha-rachamim, mitzad ha-din of rachamim. And that's Rochel Imenu, who's really, in a certain way, the single most powerful person in this world. There is no one ever who has done what this woman has done. And therefore, her schus is phenomenal in the sense that she is truly the Yeshua of Klal Yisrael from Golus towards the Geula. And we should be Zocher in her schus to finally be Zocher to the Geula itself, to finally see the Geula that the Rebbeinu Shalom has promised us thousands of years ago. 97% of human history has already gone by. Thousands of years have already gone by since Yeshaya, Yirmiyahu, and Yechezkel, since they all have promised Klal Yisrael that they will all participate in the Geula. And there is nothing. We are in the worst generation of all, the worst period, and so on. And we don't even see it. But it is imminent. It's right in front of us. This is the worst generation of all, and in a certain sense, this is the generation of the Geula itself. And we have to hope that in the schus of Rochel Imenu, that finally the promise that was made to her by God, that you are the aim of Geula, and you are really the aim in your Chetzonius, you're the mother of the redemption, but in your Panemius, in your interior, you are the mother of exile. And that's it for this year today. Any questions?
Question, comment. You're saying, if I got it right, you're saying that we couldn't survive Golus without the schus of Rochel Imenu.
Right. Because, why? Because Eretz Yisrael is a component to the Taryag mitzvahs.
Right.
And therefore we could never have completed it. Just like the Dor. We would be in the same position as the Dor HaMidbar. The Dor HaMidbar were a generation that did not have the component of Eretz Yisrael. And we would be in the same way. We would be lacking a critical organ that enables us to create Olam Haba.
Right. So my question is this: my question or comment wasn't the purpose of the Golus to take us, and we had to be Yisurin among a strange people, and either be Aymed ben Asayan or be Aymed ben Asurin and get back and be Yonik back the Oris that they took. And that was the rehabilitative process that would take place in Golus.
So therefore, what's the question?
So therefore, it's a mechanism that exists that will bring us back into balance, and not that we're therefore in danger of being destroyed because we're not in Eretz Yisrael, but we have to go out of Eretz Yisrael to go and take back that which we lost because of the sins.
Okay, very good question. But the answer is this. Who created that mechanism? Rochel Imenu. You see, before... Yes, in other words, before that Golus, the only Golus that God promised Avraham Avinu by the Bris Ben Psalm, he said, the Jews will go into Egypt. Now, was that a Golus? No, it wasn't really a Golus, and it was a kind of Golus. It had some of the properties of a Golus, but in essence, it wasn't for the purpose of Golus. The reason why Yosef went down into Mitzrayim is what? Was to qualify for the promise that the Banishim gave Avraham Avinu. But why did Avraham Avinu put the Jews in Egypt? Why did he say the Jews have to go to Egypt? It wasn't to go into slavery, because slavery was only accomplished in the last 80 years of the 210 years that the Jews were in Egypt. The reason why the Jews went into Eretz Mitzrayim was not because there was a Golus. That's not the reason. In other words, God did not tell Avraham Avinu that your children will go into Golus. He told Avraham Avinu that your children will go into Eretz Mitzrayim, into the land of Egypt. Why? So that the Jews could carve Egypt, they could carve through Egypt all of mankind, that they would all go and accept the Taryag mitzvahs. The intention of God was not only for the Jews to have the Taryag mitzvahs, God wanted every nation on earth to receive the Torah. How do we know this? Because the Medrash says that God went to every nation on earth and offered them the Taryag mitzvahs. He did. He offered them to be agents of Olam Haba. And that's why they went into Egypt, so that they would makarev Mitzrayim. God wanted Egypt to accept the 630 mitzvahs along with the Jews, and they would all go together. But instead, the Jews worshipped idols in Egypt. That's what condemned them, because they did not do their purpose. Even though Yosef HaTzadik did his purpose, because he used to give for food. He used to have them undertake a bris. All the Egyptians had to go to a bris in order to get food in the famine. Why? Why did Yosef HaTzadik make everyone take a bris? Why? Because fundamentally, all the Egyptians themselves were supposed to become Jews. So therefore, going into Egypt was not a Golus. It was the beginning of Olam Haba. It was to make everyone in the world into a transformer of Olam Haba, to give them, everyone in the world, the power to create an Olam Haba. There was never any intention, and that was supposed to be the Yemos Mashiach. When they came to Har Sinai, they were supposed to receive the tablets of the Or of Mashiach. Why? Because at Har Sinai was really the completion. So they would go into Egypt, Makav Mitzrayim, and they would all go together to Har Sinai, and they would receive the Torah in the tzur of the Nun. The Torah that was given to Har Sinai was supposed to be the 50th gate, was supposed to be the light of Mashiach. And everyone together would they would go back to Egypt, and the Jews would go to Eretz Yisrael. Or they would also go, I'm not exactly sure how the structure of that redemption. But God never said to Avraham Avinu that your children will go into Golus. But he said, probably, if they don't survive, if the Jews perform the sin of Avodah Zorah because they're influenced by the environment of Egypt, so not only will the Jews lose the schus of bringing Olam Haba at that point in time and the Yemos Mashiach, but they will lose the very power of being free. I will put them what? I will convert Mitzrayim. That's right. Mitzrayim is converted. At first, Mitzrayim was not supposed to be a Golus. Mitzrayim was supposed to be a place where the Jews would makarev Mitzrayim. So therefore, Mitzrayim became an extension of Eretz Yisrael. I don't know exactly what would have happened, but in a certain sense, it was an extension of Eretz Yisrael. But instead, the Jews betrayed that purpose, and they worshipped the idols of Egypt. So therefore, they converted Egypt into a golus. Egypt was not a golus, but Egypt became a golus because of what the Jews did themselves. And that's why God said to Avram that your your people will go into the golus of Mitzrayim, and over there, then they will be enslaved, but I will finally free them. But that was not the original plan. The original plan that Yosef was supposed to go to Egypt, and that's why he was brought to Egypt, to free the Jews and the Egyptians and the whole world from the whole tyranny of Olam Hazeh, from the obligation to do mitzvahs and go into Olam Haba. So Egypt was not a golus. And that's never supposed to happen to them, because from Matan Torah, they were supposed to go into Eretz Yisrael and start the Yemos Mashiach, right? Then. But because instead they converted Egypt into a golus, it didn't turn out that way. So when did the first real golus happen? When? It happened when Assyria first took out the 10 tribes, and when Babylonia took all the Jews out of them. So therefore, that's what created the mechanism where God said, I will convert Golus into a mechanism where it itself will take care of Zorma. In other words, instead of Golus coming from Zorma, its purpose will be to eliminate Zorma. Do you understand that? And who created that mechanism? Rochel Imenu. Because she enabled the whole possibility of Klal Yisrael going into Golus. But not only to go into Golus, what Rochel initiated was the possibility that a Golus would become a redemption. That in the Golus itself, even before the Jews leave, that Golus would itself become a redemption. That's the true power of Rochel Imenu. That by creating the possibility of a Golus, she changed the structure of the Hashkocha Protis, so that the Golus itself would have the function of saving Klal Yisrael by going into a Golus and eventually leaving. Rochel Imenu created the whole process of Golus and Gula. Golus and Gula is a process. It happens together. You see it. When you go into Golus, then you go out of Golus by going into Gula. It's a dual process. They're twins, Golus and Gula. If you go into Golus, then you have to be redeemed. Why? Because Golus itself was given a new function. It itself would be able to redeem the Jews and take them out. To what process? Well, the process that you're describing. By suffering in that Golus, the Jews would then be mechaper on the Chet and on the Zoyim that they acquired, and that would be it. But this whole process was created by Rochel Imenu. That's why a certain Kedusha was given to Golus. Golus itself has a Kedusha. It is, except that it's a Kedusha that lives inside of a Tumah. When you're not in Golus, then you can experience the Kedusha itself. The Kedusha is outside, and the Shekhinah is said to not be in Golus. But when you go into Golus, the Shekhinah goes with you. Why? Because the Kedusha of the mitzvahs goes into Golus. But that's still a Kedusha. The Panemius of Golus is a Kedusha. And therefore, Golus itself has the mechanism to be able to take oneself out of Golus. The destiny of Golus is to create the redemption, to take the Jews out. That which brings the Jews into Golus is also the mechanism which takes them out. And that's a very deep thing. She created that double mechanism where the Shekhinah can go into Golus with Klal Yisrael. Because the Shekhinah in Golus, the Shekhinah Begalusa, the Shekhinah in Golus, actually is subject to a new mechanism. That since that Golus has a Kedusha to it, eventually it will eradicate, it will be matar the Jewish people from the Golus. So that circumstance where we suffer is the circumstance which creates the Geula. It creates the ability to go out. And who did this? Who created this mechanism? Rochel Imenu. Because that was never given to Avram. You see, most people don't understand the Bris Bein Avsom. They assume that God said to Avram that your children will go into the Golus of Mitzrayim and suffer slavery, but eventually be redeemed. That was not what God said to Avram Avinu. He said your children will go into Mitzrayim not as a Golus, but to Makav them, so that everyone will go out and take the Taryag Mitzvahs and be Zocher, what? To Olam Haba. That was the promise. But God was saying what will happen, not what should happen. What should happen is the Jews will succeed in what? In converting and be Makav Mitzrayim to the Geula. And Makav to the Geula to remove the Zoyama from the Chet of Adam Rishon. But instead they didn't, because they worshipped idols themselves. So therefore they deflected the whole purpose of the going into Egypt. Egypt was not a Golus. It was simply a process of kiruv. The Jews turned it into a Golus by worshipping the idols of Egypt and enduring slavery. So that's a completely different meaning to the Bris Bein Avsom. And your question is very good. And I thank you for the question, because it allows me the possibility to really discuss what was really the promise of God to Avram Avinu. And that was done how? After the Jews had sinned and been worthy of Golus, Rochel Imenu comes along and says, no, take them out of Golus. Make that Golus their own Tahara. And why? Because of what I did for my sister. Because I gave up everything so that she should not be in pain. And God said, you have allowed me to give them the highest madrig of Vachamim, because now that Golus, which should have annihilated the Jews, will instead empower them to get out of the Golus and suddenly have a Geula. You are the mother of the Geula, and that's what I'll call you. But really, Rochel is the mother of the Golus. So tremendous things happen by what Rochel Imenu did. By allowing her sister to take her place, she created a new form of hashgacha. And this is why she is so powerful. She has an element, she's a quasi Mashiach ben Yosef itself, like her son and like her grandson, Ephraim and Manasseh. Any other question? Okay, thank you very much.
Shimon, I just want to make one point. You're saying that Klal Yisrael needs Eretz Yisrael to survive, and it's like a organism without a heart. And
because Klal Yisrael, why? Why does Klal Yisrael need Eretz Yisrael? Why?
It seems like the zichuch has to happen in Mokum as well. That's
right. Because Eretz Yisrael, the reason why Eretz Yisrael is considered Eretz HaKadosha, you know what I mean? You know why? Because the first place on earth that zichuch takes place is in Eretz Yisrael, in the Mokum HaMikdash, or the Even Shasiyah. Why is that the holiest place in the world, the Even Shasiyah, in the temple, in the Mokum of the Oren Abris? Why? Because that's the place where zichuch will start. It will start there. It will start in a great geographical location, the Even Shasiyah, which has an actual, it has a certain location on Earth, you know. It has these coordinates. I mean, it would be picked up by the satellites and so on where its location. But that location of the Even Shasiyah, which is in the Mokum HaMikdash, is the beginning of zichuch, which is the beginning of Olam Haba. So that's why Eretz Yisrael is the instrument of zichuch. It's the place where zichuch takes place, and that's why it's a holy land. That's why it can vomit people out who worship idols, because it's alive. It's alive in the sense, just like Olam Haba is alive without time. The land is alive without a soul, but it has a soul. It's the soul of zichuch.
Yeah. And now that it doesn't happen, Reb Shimon, where does the zichuch go? Now that it
zichuch is suspended. No, the zichuch will take place.
Answered you answered in the share. You said that something happens in the Pneumius. The Shechina goes, the Kedusha happens in the Pneumius, but in the Chitzonius it's suspended. Right? That's what you said earlier.
Yeah.
And that's like a very, very deep concept, that in the Pneumius today we do Kedusha, but in the Chitzonius of it, we see nothing, and everything is suspended. It's like stored in the Pneumius.
Right, so the Chitzonius, the existence of the Chitzonius, the outside, the exterior, as a Golus, is because of the Chatoim of Klal Yisrael. Yeah. But the one who made Golus into a chefsa, into an instrument of Kedusha, and therefore it can do positive things, it can get rid of Zorma itself. The Zorma is not gotten rid of by itself. It's gotten rid of through the Golus, through the actions of the Tumah. So Rochel Imenu seems to be fundamentally in charge of this. It's in her quality, dude, and that's why she's elevated to the status of a Mashiach ben Yosef. She altered the function of Mashiach ben Yosef from that of Yosef HaTzadik, which works through Golus, to a new function of a Chitzonius. She created the possibility of the Chitzonius to be Matara the Bria.
Yeah, everything is stored, and really in the Chitzonius we don't see any Tahara. Everything is on hold. Like the same.
That's
way,
why God said the main phrase that God says is what? Yesh tikva, there is hope, lachrisoyach, to the end, to the most exterior. In other words, you have created a new mechanism which allows me to use Golus to redeem them itself. So therefore, you have created hope, a new mechanism that never existed. So you see how powerful this woman was.
Yeah. So I just want to connect one thing, Rabbi Shimon, where you see that your whole share comes together. The Chitzonius of the Bria is called Alma Dizgalia, right? That's the concept that the Svarim use. The Pneumius is called Alma Dizgasia, the revealed part where we live in, and the part that's hidden, that only God knows. It's the Pneumius somehow. I don't know where that's stored, but it's the Pneumius. We don't see it. The Ramchal calls it the inside of the Teva. So the outside is terrible. It's Churban, it's Golus, but the inside somehow is where the Kedusha is stored. Now,
because the outside is Zorma.
Yeah. So these two terms, Alma Dizgasia and Alma Dizgalia, is good for what the Arizal calls Rochel and Leah, meaning Leah is the Alma Dizgasia, the Pneumius, and Rochel is the Alma Dizgalia. So what you're saying, when she gave Leah to Yaakov, she created the concept of Pneumius so we could survive. Right. She created the... You see, he's saying something so deep. I have during the shir that the act that she actually gave, when she thought that she is distancing herself from her goal, and she's cutting herself off from the Kedusha, that's when she actually created the survival of Klal Yisrael and her destiny.
Right. You're saying very good. That's the support of what I'm saying is the Ari himself. Yeah. Because she created the concept of the Alma Dizgasia. The mechanism of the Alma Dizgasia, where the Shrinta Begalusa goes into Golus, was created in a certain sense from Rochel Imenu. Yes, this is a raya.
So you see that David, which represents Kedusha, would have had no chance of being anything if she wouldn't allow Leah to marry Yaakov. When she allowed Leah to marry Yaakov, she created the Mashiach ben David, not just the Mashiach ben Yosef. Because
why she allowed him to...
From Leah, which represents Kedusha, when she gave Yaakov Leah and she stepped aside, she actually was boirei the Mashiach ben Yosef. So she didn't just do the Mashiach ben David. She didn't just create the Mashiach ben Yosef. The act that she stepped away from Yaakov, that created Soibel Chalor and the concept of Yosef. But the act that she allowed Leah to go to Yaakov created the Mashiach ben David. She actually created both. That's why she's the mother of Klal Yisrael. Both Mashiach.
Well, in truth, her destiny was to be the original, to be originally the only wife, and therefore she would have created Yehuda and David that way. So she was fulfilling her destiny in a different way. But her original
but you don't understand because
Klal
Yisrael wasn't ready for that. If she would have married Yaakov, then obviously Klal Yisrael wouldn't have survived. Klal Yisrael wasn't strong enough to have Rochel do both. The Kedusha would have been very open and very strong. They didn't have the Kalim for that. So Klal Yisrael's state to survive had to go through this new mechanism of Leah. And if she wouldn't have done anything, she would have married Yaakov, then Klal Yisrael, probably a lot of the neshamas wouldn't have survived. I think Ramchal says this openly. And so she had a chance either to go herself and cut out a big part of Klal Yisrael, or allow Klal Yisrael survive and let Yaakov marry Leah. And she did that.
Well, what she did was what she did was she created a new level of Zorma. You see, Mashiach ben Yosef was created. That concept was created by the Chet of Adam Rishon. That was already done. Mashiach ben Yosef is considered like a wheelchair. A wheelchair for who? For Mashiach ben David. In other words, Mashiach ben David crippled himself and would have annihilated himself. But along came the Mashiach ben Yosef from the Mashiach ben David, and suddenly he became the mechanism of a wheelchair. So now the Mashiach ben Yosef, when you look at the Mashiach ben David, he's crippled. He's crippled and he sits on a wheelchair. And that's what it means. The Alma discussion and the Alma discalia, that what the Zoyim, the concept of Zoyim, was created by the sin of Adam Rishon. That's where Mashiach ben David is allowed to survive. But what she did is she created a new concept in the mechanism of Mashiach ben Yosef. The Mashiach ben Yosef concept enables the possibility of Zorma. The Malach HaMovas then became the ultimate Malach of the Geula through Zorma. But what happened was with Rochel, when she gave up the thing for her sister, she created up not the principle of Zorma. That was created before, but she created a new form of that mechanism, which is what? Which is total Golus. Before that, there was another form of Golus. If you remember, in most of the Nevi'im, Klal Yisrael had enemies who were inside of Eretz Yisrael. Like Klal Yisrael was in Golus by the Plishtim, right? The Plishtim lived in Eretz Yisrael, they lived in Gaza. So they lived in Eretz Yisrael, but they dominated Klal Yisrael and they caused them suffering. That's called an internal Golus. So that was created from the Chet of Adam Rishon, from the Zoyim at that level. When if there would be a Golus, it would be inside of the land of Israel. But Klal Yisrael would not go outside because they would be annihilated. For a Golus to appear outside of the land of Israel is termination, but not inside of Israel. That's why throughout the entire Tanakh you see the different Golus that with Barak, with Shimshon Agibor, all these types of Golus happened inside the land of Israel. So therefore they were kind of a passive Golus. They were a nominal Golus. But what happened with Rochel Imenu, she therefore was at the time, she therefore had to protect Klal Yisrael not only from an internal Golus, but from an external Golus as well. And that would finally occur when Klal Yisrael will be exiled from the land of Israel itself. Because that meant death. Because it would absent the third component of the organism called the Jewish people. So therefore, what she did was she therefore took care of that. She allowed the mechanism of Golus to itself be a machaper. Golus itself would matara Klal Yisrael. Just like death is matara the body, Golus itself, complete removal of the neshama from the guf, complete removal of Klal Yisrael from Golus, will be their redemption itself. So that's what God said. When God said to Yesh Tikva L'Yisayach, what was the inner meaning of that? What it means that the Golus that you now allow me to do, and you allow me to create that as a new mechanism to remove Zoma, which never existed before. The only mechanism that allowed me to remove Zoma was the mechanism of an internal Golus. Inside the land of Israel, they will be oppressed. But that they should go outside of the land of Israel? No. Rochel Imenu created the new form of what's called total Golus. There's partial Golus and total Golus. So by Adam Rishon, the Zohar created what's called partial Golus, where the oppressed nation would be in a population who would live in the land of Israel and oppress Jews. But that there should be a total Golus, that the Jewish people should experience a complete removal from that environment called Eretz Yisrael, where the Zichuch should take place, that they should no longer be connected to the Mokum of Zichuch. That's impossible until Rochel Imenu. By giving, in the sense that Rochel gave her destiny to her sister, she acquired for Klal Yisrael the mechanism of a dual. There is now Golus in a dual fashion, two ways. A Golus, what do you call it? There's dual, in the sense that both mechanisms would allow Klal Yisrael to survive. Whether they have a Golus inside of Israel or whether they have a Golus outside of Israel, both of these would become mechanisms which would redeem the Jewish people from the Zohar. That's Rochel Imenu. Rochel Imenu is the creator of the second Golus, which is the Alma Diskasia. There was no such thing as before Rochel Imenu as Alma Diskasia. It's only because of her sacrifice that allowed the Alma Diskasia that there should be a dual Golus, a dual mechanism of the Tahara of Zohar. And this is the goddess. So therefore, she is like a second Mashiach ben Yosef. You know what I mean? The first actual Mashiach ben Yosef was created was really Cain. That's why the story of Cain and Havel is so great. Cain was actually Mashiach ben Yosef, and Cain and Havel could have redeemed the sin of Adam and Rishon. They were the only human beings besides Adam and Chava that could have redeemed the Chet of Adam and Rishon, but they didn't, because of Cain killed Havel and completely turned over the whole Bria. So therefore, after that, the Mashiach ben Yosef had to be someone else, Chanoich, or it had to be Noach, Avraham Avinu, and so on and so forth. But Rochel did something else. She created the concept of an Alma Diskasia, that the Golus itself from an extreme form, where the Jews would totally leave what? The Mokum of Zichuch, and still survive, you know what I mean? Without the mitzvahs that are Tuluy B'Aretz, without the mitzvahs that are associated with the land of Israel, was created by Rochel Imenu. And that's what it means, Yesh Tikva. You have created the possibility of redemption, because you have made a new form of Golus that in itself will redeem the Jewish people. And that did not exist before. So this is all very deep. What Rochel Imenu did was not simply a measure of self-sacrifice. It was the creation of a new mechanism of Golus, of the extreme form, Alma Diskasia. And that's what God means, Yesh Tikva. Now you have hope. We have hope that even if the Jews leave Eretz Yisrael, leave the land of Zichuch, they will still survive. And that Golus itself, the suffering from that Golus, will eventually matara the Zohar and redeem the Jewish people. So this is a major event in the mazel of Klal Yisrael, in the process of Klal Yisrael. The event that was occurred by Rochel Imenu is part and possible. It is a major undertaking and a major conclusion, and so forth. And therefore, in that sense, Rochel Imenu reached the level of a quasi Mashiach ben Yosef, like her son. And she became the mother of the Mashiach ben Yosef, and Yosef became an Ovim, a partial of. So therefore, we see that this story of what she was able to do was monumental. So we put all these facts together, we suddenly see a certain depth that does not appear on the surface. It's the depth of two worlds. An Alma, which is Begilui, and Alma Diskasia, that's Behester. And this is a profound understanding of who Rochel was. And in the schus of Rochel Imenu, and the schus that the Almud is, that our Almud is scattered, that we suffer from, should itself redeem us and take us out of the Golus, and we should finally experience all the light of the Nun Sharabina and the Geula itself.
Amen. Amen. Wow. Amen. Thank you, Reb Shimon.
Okay, so that's the shir in the schus of Rochel Imenu. And let the shir also be the schus. Let the shir also be a schus for Michael Jacobson's wife and so on, and for my son. Okay, thank you very much.